In the last PokéStudies, I talked about how I think the Pokemon world is a version of our world where the history is mostly the same. I think that's a stance I can be pretty solid on. I also said that I think the regions actually take the place of the real-world counterparts. So the first 4 generations, they're not based on Japan. They actually take place in Japan. And this stance is more debatable, but I find the evidence pretty convincing. There are obviously a lot of differences between the real-world locations and the regions that they inspired, and it might be difficult to see how they could be literally the same place. And to that I offer 2 explanations that probably work together. Think about this. The games are heavily simplified, and I don't mean the gameplay, I mean the world of the games. So much is ignored because it's just not relevant. We know there are cars, but there's very few roads. We barely see any form of government. I mean, the protagonist doesn't even have to eat or sleep. If so much of how this world works is left out of the games, of course the geography is going to be different. We're walking and biking everywhere, so we need footpaths, not roads. We can get away with a town that has only 4 houses. It doesn't mean that there's literally only 4 houses there, but that's all that we need to see. So it's likely that the regions had to suffer some simplifications on a macro scale as well. Some cities and landmarks get moved around a little bit, or in Alola we can condense the 8 main Hawaiian islands to just 4 without losing too much. And the other explanation for why things don't match perfectly is that this is a version of our world, and admittedly it is a version that's more different than what we see in Harry Potter. But some things would have developed differently even if the overall thread of history is very similar, and that could explain the different names and most of the other differences too. As for the similarities though, well, there's a lot of them. Almost every landmark in the Pokemon regions has a real-world counterpart. There's cities like Lumio's representing Paris, or geographical features like Mount Chimney being Mount Aso, Japan's biggest active volcano. Huge touristic spots like the Entralink taking the place of Central Park, and even pretty small things like how Cyanwood City, which is where you get the secret potion to cure Amphi, is Naruto City, where a big pharmaceutical company called Otsuka was founded. I put the link to that Bulbapedia page with all of the references in the description again. I don't think it's worth me spewing off literally hundreds of factoids when you can just look them up if you're interested. What I do want to mention though is that as far as we can tell, all the geographic relationships between the regions seem to match up with their real-world counterparts too. Johto is to the west of Kanto and Sinnoh is to the north. The map of Hoenn is rotated compared to Kyushu, but I don't think there's any reason to think that it isn't just seen from a different angle. The political relationships are pretty similar too, especially for the first 4 generations. I know a lot of people think of the regions as countries, but if you really think about it, they're more like states. All you see on the maps are towns and cities. There's no indications of other subdivisions. You can walk and bike pretty much everywhere, and that's much more manageable on a state scale than on a national scale. I mean, the time scales are obviously different too, but if you wanted to walk from Kyoto, where Ecruteak is based on, to Hyogo, where Olivine is based on, it would take you about 15 hours. And that is a lot, but it's also doable. The only time you really travel directly from one region to another is on the magnet train, a bullet train. I mean, you technically could walk and surf all the way from Cyanwood to, like, Lavender, but even in game time scales, you wouldn't want to do that. And while we don't really see subdivisions of the regions like you'd expect if they were countries, we actually do see higher levels of organization. There's a man in the Blackthorn City Pokemon Center that tells you about the Pokemon League, and he says that the strongest trainers in the country gather there. And since we know that Kanto and Johto share the Indigo League, that means that they're also both part of the same country. The Pokédex actually gives us the biggest clue. The Pokédex that includes all of the known Pokemon from every region is called the National Pokédex. That implies that all of the regions are part of the same nation. And we even see a level above that. The international police that Looker is a part of just straight up is Interpol, and it implies that there's other nations out there, other countries out there. Okay, That all works very well for Kanto, Johto, Hoenn, and Sinnoh, since they actually are all regions in Japan. Things do start to break apart when you look at the other regions. Unova is pretty much just based on New York City and some nearby parts of New Jersey, and Kalos is based on the entire country of France, so the geographical scales there are completely off. But they still have the national Pokédex, so how can Kalos be France, but still belong to the same country as some regions of Japan? And I admit that Kalos and Unova are the weakness of this theory, but the fact that these regions are completely separate from the first four doesn't necessarily mean that they're not part of the same country. Think of all of the enormous kingdoms of our past and how, even today, many of those countries still have overseas territories. Even Canada is still subject to the British monarchy. I would not be surprised if a British national Pokédex included Pokémon from Canada and other countries from the Commonwealth. There's no reason the Pokémon world can't have a similar thing. And remember that people in Kalos speak with French expressions. And even people like Fantina, who we see in other regions, have a French accent and are probably just from Kalos. Kalos just is France, even if the geography is much more simplified than other regions. But what really ties it together, I think, is Alola. Alola is an isolated island region, but it has lots of influence from other regions like Kanto and Johto. This reflects Hawaii having lots of Japanese influence too. And Alola has the involvement of Looker and Interpol, but it doesn't have the national Pokédex. Alola isn't part of the same country as the other regions. Alola also doesn't have a Pokemon League, or rather it's established at the very end of the games. And while the Pokemon League is independent from government, it could actually be a part of Alola's bid for statehood within the Pokemon Nation. I say this because I find that Alola's new league reflects Hawaii's relatively recent statehood. Hawaii had government. It was independent before the Hawaiian monarchy was overthrown and the United States annexed it as a territory in the 1890s. But when it became a state in 1959, it gained a voice in US national politics. Alola also had government. After all, Hau'oli boasts a city hall long before there was a Pokemon League. But Alola establishes the Pokemon League so they can try to be on the same level as the other regions. There's one more thing I need to address because one of you brought it to my attention in the comments of the last PokéStudies. There is a swimmer in Oraz that says he will swim to Kalos. You also see him in Azure Bay, so obviously he succeeded. This does heavily imply that Hoenn and Kalos are within swimming distance, maybe something like the English Channel, which is a challenging cross that some people have done, and that is definitely not possible between Japan and France. But there's two reasons I don't see this as a problem. The first is the confirmed timeline, which puts at least 5 years between the events of the Hoenn games and the events of X and Y. I'm not saying the swimmer actually swam all the way from Japan to France over 5 years, but in this time it would have been possible for him to, say, attempt a number of challenging swims as he slowly made his way from Japan to France. The second reason is that, honestly, I'm not convinced he actually did it. I'm not saying he was lying, although that is possible. But whenever there's remakes, the games that share a generation with them have tons of references to that region. The Oceanic Museum in Slateport has a miniature of the SS Anne. Diamond and Pearl begin with a newscast about the Red Gyarados. The guy who says he swam over from Hoenn is probably just a teaser for Oraz since they weren't announced yet when X and Y came out. I have one final piece of evidence that supports the regions actually being the places they are quote-unquote based on. In the interview he recently did with Eurogamer about the Let's Go games, Junichi Masuda says the setting of the story is the Kanto region, which is a region in Japan which is known for or strongly associated with summer, or having a nice kind of summer atmosphere. Let's Go takes place in a region of Japan. I know there could be something lost in translation here, which is why I don't say this as definitive proof, but I find it pretty convincing when combined with everything else. That said though, if you can poke holes in this theory, please be my guest, let me know in the comments. Either way, thank you so much for watching. Please hit the like button and share this video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe if you're new here. I'm Umbreon Libris, and I'll see you in the next chapter.